Picture this. It's January 1943. You're a German soldier, huddled in a frozen trench outside Stalingrad. The temperature has dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Your boots are frozen to your feet. Your rifle won't fire because the metal has contracted in the cold. And a frozen hell that broke the strongest men, and a place where the rules of civilized warfare simply didn't exist. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. They came with confidence, equipped with the latest technology, and backed by the most successful military machine in the world. These men had conquered Poland in weeks, defeated France in months, and seemed unstoppable. They expected to be home by Christmas, victorious once again. But by the war's end, the Eastern Front had claimed the lives of more than 2 million German soldiers, with millions more wounded, captured, or simply vanishing into the vast expanses of Russia. Entire divisions, units containing 15,000 men, would be wiped from existence in single battles. Army groups that represented the cream of German military might would need to examine the individual experiences, the daily struggle for survival, and the gradual breakdown of human endurance under conditions that defied imagination. The winter of 1941 to 1942 marked the beginning of the end for German hopes in the East. As temperatures plummeted to levels that seemed impossible to survive, German soldiers discovered they were fighting two enemies, the Red Army and the Russian winter itself. Still clutching their rifles, their faces twisted in expressions of agony that would haunt the survivors forever. He wrote about how frostbite claimed more casualties than enemy bullets, how men would fight over scraps of food that were frozen harder than stone. The German army had prepared for a quick summer campaign. Their uniforms were lightweight cotton and wool, their equipment designed for the temperate climates of Western Europe. When winter arrived early and with unprecedented severity, soldiers found themselves completely unprepared. Many still wore the same summer uniforms they had marched east with months earlier, their thin fabric offering no protection against winds that could strip flesh from bone. Soldiers developed desperate methods of survival. They would huddle together in groups, sharing body heat in arrangements that violated every military regulation. They burned furniture, books, even pieces of their own equipment to create tiny fires that provided momentary relief. Some units resorted to sheltering inside the carcasses of dead horses, the animal's body providing a windbreak that could mean the difference between life and death. But what made this worse was watching their Soviet counterparts, who seemed better adapted to these conditions. Soviet soldiers had winter equipment designed for their climate, knew how to find food in the wilderness, and understood how to survive in their own homeland. For German soldiers, this created a psychological burden on top of the physical hardships. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles from Germany to the front, crossing destroyed bridges, bombed-out railway stations, and roads that turned to impassable mud with each spring thaw. Every mile of this journey was fraught with danger from partisan attacks, mechanical breakdowns, and the sheer impossibility of moving massive quantities of supplies across infrastructure that had been systematically destroyed. German soldiers on the front lines went days without hot food. When supplies did arrive, they were often spoiled, frozen solid, or insufficient for the number of men who needed them. Medical supplies ran out completely in some sectors, forcing field surgeons to operate without anesthesia and use vodka as disinfectant. Ammunition became so scarce that orders were issued forbidding soldiers from firing unless they had a clear target. The contrast with in winter, they became ice-covered graves for the living, with walls that were harder than concrete and floors covered in a mixture of ice and human waste. In summer, they turned into muddy cesspools breeding disease and despair. German soldiers lived in these conditions for months at a time, sharing their cramped spaces with rats, lice, and the omnipresent smell of death. The rats were particularly problematic. They would eat anything they could find, including the flesh of sleeping soldiers who were too exhausted to fight them off. Lice spread diseases that could kill as efficiently as bullets, and the close quarters made infection almost inevitable. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford, as Soviet attacks could come at any hour of the day or night. Men would take turns standing watch, but exhaustion would often overcome vigilance. Many soldiers learned to sleep standing up, leaning against the trench walls with their rifles in their hands, ready to fight at a moment's notice. The psychological toll was enormous. Letters home, when they could be written, spoke of men who had aged years and months, who had seen things that would haunt them forever, and who had lost faith in everything they once believed. Young men who had entered the war with enthusiasm found themselves questioning everything they had been taught about honor, duty, and the glory of war. For 872 days, German forces surrounded Leningrad in one of the longest and most brutal sieges in military history. The soldiers assigned to maintain this siege faced their own form of hell. They watched a city slowly starve while they themselves struggled with inadequate supplies and constant attacks from desperate defenders. German artillery units shelled the city daily, but the psychological impact on the gunners was severe. Many reported nightmares about the civilians they were targeting. The siege became a war of attrition that wore down the besiegers as much as the besieged. The fighting around Leningrad was particularly vicious because Soviet defenders were fighting for their homes and families. They showed a ferocity that German soldiers had not encountered in their earlier campaigns. Here, every building became a fortress, every street a battlefield where civilians and soldiers fought side by side with a desperation that shocked even hardened German veterans. They never made it home. They died of exhaustion, starvation, or enemy action in forests and fields, far from anyone who would ever know their fate. Their bodies would be found years later by farmers or hunters, still wearing the remnants of German uniforms. During these retreats, German soldiers witnessed the complete breakdown of military discipline that had once been the foundation of their success. Units fragmented as men looked out for their own survival rather than maintaining unit cohesion. Officers found their authority meaningless when they had no supplies to distribute and no reinforcements to call upon. The proud Wehrmacht was reduced to scattered groups of desperate men trying to escape the consequences of their invasion. Beyond the conventional battles, German soldiers faced a constant threat from Soviet partisans operating behind the lines. These irregular fighters turned the entire Eastern Front into a battlefield where there were no safe areas, no secure rear positions, and no respite from the constant threat of attack. Partisan warfare was particularly devastating to morale because it violated every conventional understanding of how war was supposed to work. Enemies could be anywhere: the farmer working in his field, the woman selling bread in the market, the child playing by the roadside. German soldiers learned to trust no one and suspect everyone. Partisan attacks on supply convoys meant that German soldiers never knew if their next meal or ammunition resupply would arrive. Soldiers assigned to guard duty or escort missions lived in constant fear of ambush. The psychological stress of never knowing when or where the next attack would come broke many men before they ever saw conventional combat. The methods used by partisans were particularly unsettling to German soldiers trained in conventional warfare. Partisans would attack and then disappear into the civilian population, making it impossible to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. They used improvised weapons, booby traps, and ambush tactics that seemed designed more to terrorize than to achieve military objectives. Medical care on the Eastern Front was primitive at best and often non-existent. Field hospitals were overcrowded, understaffed, and frequently under attack. German medics worked under impossible conditions, trying to save lives with inadequate supplies and equipment, while often coming under fire themselves. Frostbite injuries were so common that entire hospital wards were dedicated to amputations. Surgeons would work around the clock, removing frozen fingers, toes, hands, and feet from soldiers who had been exposed to temperatures that human bodies simply couldn't survive. The psychological trauma of watching previously whole men reduced to helpless invalids was devastating for both patients and medical staff. Infections that would have been easily treatable in peacetime became death sentences on the Eastern Front. Without proper antibiotics, antiseptics, or even clean bandages, simple wounds could become gangrenous infections that killed otherwise healthy young men. Diseases spread rapidly through the ranks, weakening units before they ever engaged the enemy. The psychological wounds were even harder to treat than physical injuries. Shell shock affected thousands of German soldiers who had witnessed horrors that their minds simply couldn't process. But in the middle of a desperate war, there was little time or resources for mental health care. Men who should have been hospitalized were sent back to the front lines to continue fighting. The Battle of Stalingrad became the symbol of German suffering on the Eastern Front. Over 200,000 German soldiers were trapped in the city as Soviet forces closed the noose around them, creating a pocket of desperation that would become legendary for its horror. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe that played out over months. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, German soldiers faced starvation, disease, and constant bombardment while fighting house by house, room by room, in ruins that barely resembled a city. The urban environment created a hellish landscape where normal military tactics were useless and survival became a matter of individual cunning and luck. The winter conditions made everything worse, as soldiers fought for scraps of food and fuel in temperatures that killed as efficiently as enemy bullets. Men would risk their lives to recover a single can of food from a destroyed building. The German supply situation became so desperate that horses were slaughtered for food. Then leather equipment was boiled into soup, and finally men would eat anything they could find that might provide nutrition. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, sent increasingly desperate messages to his superiors describing the deteriorating conditions. His reports painted a picture of an army in its death throes, with soldiers collapsing from hunger and exhaustion, medical facilities overwhelmed with casualties they couldn't treat, and combat units reduced to shadows of their former strength. The final weeks of the Stalingrad pocket saw the complete breakdown of organized resistance. German soldiers, reduced to walking skeletons by starvation and disease, could barely hold their weapons. When the surrender finally came in February 1943, only about 90,000 German soldiers were left alive out of the original force of over 200,000. For those German soldiers who survived to become prisoners of war, their ordeal was far from over. Soviet prisoner of war camps were brutal places where survival depended on luck, cunning, and an iron will to live. The journey to these camps often took weeks or months, with prisoners marching hundreds of miles in the same terrible conditions that had defeated them as soldiers. Many died on these marches, their bodies left beside the roads as grim reminders of the price of invasion. The survivors arrived at camps that were barely equipped to handle the massive influx of prisoners, creating overcrowded conditions where disease could spread rapidly and adequate food was a fantasy. In the camps themselves, German prisoners faced starvation rations that provided barely enough calories to sustain life, let alone the energy needed for the backbreaking labor they were forced to perform. They worked in mines, forests, and construction projects under guards who viewed them as criminals rather than prisoners of war entitled to basic human rights. Diseases ran rampant through the overcrowded barracks, killing men who had survived years of combat. The psychological impact of watching comrades die from preventable diseases after surviving the horrors of combat broke many men who had previously shown remarkable resilience. Not all German soldiers on the Eastern Front fought in major battles or famous sieges. Thousands served in isolated outposts, communication stations, and supply depots scattered across the vast Soviet landscape. When the retreat began, many of these units found themselves completely cut off from the main German forces. These forgotten soldiers faced a terrible choice: attempt the dangerous journey back to German lines through hundreds of miles of enemy territory, or try to hide and wait for rescue that might never come. Many chose to keep fighting from their isolated positions, holding out for months with no hope of reinforcement or evacuation. Some of these isolated units continued fighting long after the official end of the war in Europe. Soviet forces would occasionally stumble upon German soldiers who had been surviving in the wilderness for years, still believing they were fighting for a cause that no longer existed. These men had created their own private hells, living like animals in the forest while maintaining the pretense of military order. The letters that German soldiers sent home from the Eastern Front provide some of the most heartbreaking evidence of their suffering. Heavily censored by military authorities, these letters still managed to convey the horror of their situation to families back in Germany. Soldiers wrote about the cold that never seemed to end, about friends who had died in ways that defied imagination, and about their growing doubt that they would ever see home again. They described landscapes that looked like alien planets, populated by enemies who seemed to possess superhuman endurance. Many letters stopped arriving altogether as communication lines were cut and units were destroyed. For families back home, the silence was often the first indication that their loved ones had become casualties of the Eastern Front. The contrast between propaganda images of victorious German soldiers and the reality described in these letters created growing awareness that the war in the East was going very badly. By 1944, entire German army groups were being destroyed in massive Soviet offensives. Army Group Center, once containing over 400,000 men, was virtually annihilated in Operation Bagration. The survivors scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, many never to be seen again. The final months of the war saw German soldiers fighting desperate rearguard actions as they retreated toward Germany. Units that had once been proud divisions were reduced to company-sized groups of exhausted men who continued fighting out of habit more than hope. Equipment was abandoned on a scale that defied comprehension. Tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles worth millions were left by the roadside as their crews fled on foot. The German war machine was reduced to scattered remnants trying to delay the inevitable. Many German soldiers fighting in these final battles knew the war was lost, but continued fighting out of loyalty to their comrades or fear of capture. The Eastern Front had become a trap from which there was no escape. The statistics tell only part of the story of German suffering on the Eastern Front. Beyond the 2 million dead and millions more wounded or captured, there were the psychological casualties, men who survived physically, but were broken mentally by their experiences. Veterans of the Eastern Front who made it home carried scars that never healed. They had nightmares about the frozen steppes, about comrades who had died in their arms, about decisions they had made or failed to make. Many could never speak about their experiences, carrying their trauma in silence until their deaths decades later. The Eastern Front had taken the German army, once considered the finest military force in the world, and destroyed it completely. The men who marched east in 1941 with confidence and pride returned as broken survivors of an ordeal that had tested the very limits of human endurance. The German experience on the Eastern Front serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war. These were not just statistics or strategic failures. They were individual human beings who suffered and died far from home in conditions of unimaginable hardship. The Eastern Front consumed an entire generation of German men, destroying families, devastating communities, and forcing a nation to confront the consequences of its actions. The suffering of German soldiers, while ultimately the result of their nation's aggression, remains a testament to the horror of modern warfare. The frozen battlefields of Russia became a graveyard for millions, a place where human endurance was tested beyond its limits and found wanting. For those who lived through it, the Eastern Front was about survival, about maintaining humanity in inhuman conditions, and about the terrible price that individuals pay for the collective decisions of their societies. Their story deserves to be remembered, not to glorify war, but to understand its true cost and to honor the memory of all who suffered in that frozen hell that stretched across the vastness of Eastern Europe. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.